Today's webinar is going to be on the National Deer Association's Deer Report 2022. We have, it's going to focus on trends in harvest and management programs with a focus on Maryland. Next month, we will, on May 18th, 2022, we will have Dr. Jennifer Mullinex, an assistant professor with the University of Maryland, talking about her work on mitigating wildlife and human risk of contact with ticks in Maryland. She has been doing a lot of work on Lyme disease and other tick-borne diseases in Maryland. So that'll be a great webinar to hear from one of our professors at University of Maryland campus, College Park campus. So today's speaker, I'm pleased to introduce Kip Adams. He's a Chief Conservation Officer with the National Deer Association. His email is here. It's kip@deerassociation.com. And I will briefly give us a poll here and let Kip take it away. We'd like to have a question and find out, where's everybody living? What county, what section of Maryland do you live in? Go ahead and fill out your poll. We can get a bit of a feel for this. We got great participation. Everybody's coming in. 71% of people have filled out the little survey, 80% now. All right, and share the results here. So we've got about a quarter of the participants are from outside of Maryland, and we have very even distribution from the rest of the state. A lot of them Southern Maryland, Central Maryland, Western, and Eastern. Eastern is the lowest, which is funny because we're based over here on the Eastern Shore. But this is great to see a variety of present participants from around the state. With that, I will let us carry on and say if you have any questions, any questions about extension programs, you can feel free to email me at lukemac@umd.edu. But with that, I'm going to stop sharing and let Kip take over and share his screen and start his presentation.
All right, that sounds great. Thank you, Luke. I certainly appreciate it and appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to talk with your folks. It's pretty nice to see a balanced audience here from outside of the state and as well as from across your state. So with that, welcome everybody. I hope you're having a great spring day. My name is Kip Adams. I'm the Chief Conservation Officer from the National Deer Association. Certainly love to talk about deer, and we're going to get to share with you some information from our 2022 deer report, which looks at deer harvest, deer age structures of harvest, the most pressing issues impacting deer harvest programs today and deer management programs from across the whitetails range. And then with a special focus on Maryland to let you know exactly what's going on within your state. So just start with a little introduction to this, just to kind of set the stage for this, just the simple importance of hunters and obviously everything that we talk about relative to deer harvest here has a hunter component. And hunters are our nation's original conservationists. And we can look here at Aldo Leopold and, Teddy Roosevelt. But from a current perspective, we know that they continue to fund the lion's share of wildlife conservation today. In addition to that, studies show that hunting can act as a natural antidepressant, which is pretty cool, can improve mental health, can improve self-esteem, provide camaraderie for family, bonding. And, this is a big reason why folks hunt today. They want to be with others and get to spend this time together. And of course, it can provide healthy, low-fat food. I share this picture specifically. This is my young son, Bo, and his, this is a big deal. Anything that my kids harvest, we make it a huge deal to let during, dinner or supper time to thank them for providing supper, for providing that meal. And I show this picture because this actually came from Maryland. I live in northern Pennsylvania. Very fortunate to have a good friend in Maryland, provides an opportunity for my son to come down and hunt in your archery season each year before our archery season starts. So you're looking at some Maryland backstraps there from a doe this past hunting season. So with that, everything that I'm going to share with you today comes from our 2022 deer report. We've been doing these for more than the past decade now. All of the data that I share with you comes from your state wildlife agency, as well as all the other state wildlife agencies across the United States. Each September, we do an annual survey with the deer project leader from each state, and they provide us information on the number of deer that were harvested the year before, age structures of those deer, and there's a whole series of other questions. So all of this ends up in this report. So everything that I talk about today came from the state wildlife agencies, and it's included in this report. You can grab this on our website. And I'll share some information later on where that is. They're all free downloads. So, it's all state by state listings of how this data breaks out. So if you're interested in seeing how your state compares to others around you or others in your region or even other states in the country, you can grab this and very quickly see what the numbers are. But I'm going to start with kind of breaking this out. And we have state by state numbers for everything in there. I obviously don't have time to talk about all of those today. So I'm going to break them into regions. And most of what I discuss will be the 3 regions east of this black line. That's right down through the Rocky Mountains there, the Midwest, the Northeast, and the Southeast. East of this, there's 37 states there. Those 37 states are home to about 80% of the hunters in the United States. And more importantly, they're home to about 97% of the whitetails. We also have data from the West, but some of the states in the West provide us data on whitetails. Some provide us data on mule deer harvest, and some can only provide a deer harvest. It's whitetails and mule deer combined. So what we do is we divide that out just so that we can compare, just the whitetail harvest in those 3 regions that you see east of the Rocky Mountains. So as we go through, when I reference the 3 regions, those are the ones that I'm talking about. In many of the numbers that I share, we need to keep in mind that, as hunters and as whitetail enthusiasts, we think about things like, state regulations and, timing of our seasons and all of these other variables that go into impacting the number of deer that get shot. But one of the things that in many cases, the variable that has the biggest impact is the number of deer hunters in any given state. But this is one that deer hunters often don't think about. They think about what their opportunities are and, and how that may compare to other states, but they fail to realize, hey, how does the sheer number of people who go afield each year impact this? So I'm going to share some data here to kind of set the stage relative to what this means. And we know with this that there are somewhere between 10 and 11 million deer hunters in the United States. This ranges from about 5,000 in Rhode Island to over 770,000 in Texas. But, all the states aren't the same size, so this isn't real meaningful. But we can also then look at this on a per square mile basis. And we know that states like Nevada and New Mexico, they have less than 1 hunter per square mile. Up to the maximum, my home state of Pennsylvania has about 15 hunters per square mile. So simply by having more hunters per square mile makes a huge difference relative to what we see in deer harvest. In Maryland, where we're talking about today, you have about 220,000 deer hunters in your state, and that comes out to be at about an average of about 6 per square mile. And I'll share some more information with us here in just a minute to kind of show you how that fits in across the country. We know that of all these deer hunters nationally, about 15% of them are going to hunt with a muzzleloader. Just over a third of them hunt with either a bow or a crossbow, and just over 3/4 of them will hunt with a firearm, this being either a rifle or a shotgun, whatever may be legal in your jurisdiction. So if we come back to this map that I just showed you, how we get our harvest numbers, if we take in and overlay this with deer hunter numbers, we know that in general, the Western US only averages about 1 hunter per square mile. Lots of wide open places and beautiful scenery, but man, just not many hunters at all. As you get further east, the southeastern US averages about 4 deer hunters per square mile. The Midwest averages about 5 deer hunters per square mile, and the Northeast averages about 9. So far more, than any other region. And then, as we said, Maryland comes in at somewhere around 6 deer hunters per square mile. So with that, let's talk about some of the harvest data. One of the things that we always ask state wildlife agencies for is the sheer number of antlerless and antler deer that get shot, and then the age structures of those. And we'll start here with the percentage of all of the bucks that get shot, or all of the antlered bucks, those that are 1.5 and older, the percentage of those that are only 1.5 years old. And I will say this, the data that I'm going to share here is from the 2020 into 21 deer season. And the reason for that is we publish our annual report every January. So our 2022 report came out in January of this year. And what that means is the 2020 into 21 deer season was the most recent deer season that all of the data was in, analyzed by the state wildlife agencies, and then available to be able to given to us. Because most states in January of this year, they still had their 21 into 22 deer season still going on. So all of the data here comes from the 2021 deer season. So of all of the antler bucks that got shot in this, only about 26% of them were 1.5 years old. And this is the lowest national average that's ever been reported. And in fact, in Maryland, we didn't have the age structure this year. The DNR was not able to provide that. But you see, I have 41% here in parentheses, and that's because the prior 2 years, it was about 41% of all the antler bucks were 1.5 years old. So if you think about this, that's well less than half of the deer or half of the buck harvest out there, which is a very good thing. It's higher than the national average, but this is still in a very, very good spot. This is a very healthy situation. This is allowing the majority of those bucks to, to increase to 2.5 years of age and to kind of fill out the other age classes. So overall, from an age perspective, you guys are in a very good situation there. This is if you take a look at the graph, we have been monitoring the percentage of the buck harvest that's only 1.5 from 1989 to now. Back in 1989, well over 60% of all the bucks shot were 1.5. And take a look at how this has declined over the past couple of decades. This is in part, some states have antler restrictions, and we'll address some of that later. Some don't, but they encourage hunters to pass yearling bucks. A lot of this is just simply a cultural change. Historically, hunters would shoot the first legal buck they saw, and some certainly still do that, but it's not the majority anymore. The majority of hunters today are much more likely to pass on a yearling buck, even if it is eligible for harvest. Let that deer get a year older and try to harvest a deer that's older with larger antlers. And it's been a big drop in the percentage of all the buck shot that are just 1.5 years old. Well, let's look at the other half of that then. We always ask the percentage of all the bucks harvested that are at least 3.5 years old. So there might be 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, the 3.5 or older. And the percentage of this that hit this age class was 41%. This is the highest national average ever reported here, in large part because we just simply continue to harvest fewer yearlings. And what this means is that hunters now shoot far more bucks across the whitetails range that are at least 3.5 years old than those that are just 1.5. So this is a fundamentally huge switch in what we see from a deer harvest today, as opposed to a couple of decades ago. I don't have this data from Maryland. Maryland breaks their harvest down into those that are 1.5 and then those that are 2.5 and older. So they don't have the percentage that are 3.5 and older. So I can't share this part with you, but I will bet that this is a little lower than the national average, simply because you harvest a little higher percentage of yearlings. But still, we know that a very good number of bucks in Maryland make it into these older age classes. Well, I'm going to put both of those together on a graph here, and we can see for the last 20 seasons here, this is the percentage of all the bucks shot that were just 1.5 years old, to kind of let you see how this has declined. But if we overlay it with the percentage that are 3.5 and older, it is incredibly remarkable that back in 2015 was the first year that hunters actually shot more bucks that were at least 3.5 than just 1. And then since then, that has continued, that trend has, and then it's growing. In most cases, this would be outstanding. It means we have the most natural age structure from the buck side that we've had in at least the last 100 years. So that is great. Well, it's great everywhere except when we start talking about being inside a CWD zone or a disease zone. We know that older bucks are more likely to have the disease than younger bucks. So that comes into a big play relative to harvest restrictions and or management goals. To be able, should we let deer get into these older age classes, or should we try to harvest them earlier? That's a big point of discussion in every single state that has CWD. Some states are going about that a little differently, but suffice to say, if you're in a state with this disease, that is absolutely one of the top subjects for discussion relative to what you want for a standing crop of deer. But suffice to say, with what we're seeing here, there's no doubt that we have a more natural age structure today from a whitetail perspective than we have in at least the last 100 years. All right. Well, those 3 regions then, the Northeast, Southeast, and the Midwest we talked about, collectively shot over 3 million antlered deer, which was 5% higher than the year before. This is what we're looking at for the last several seasons with just the antlered buck harvest. In 2017, we had a record buck harvest. So if you take a look at this, we have really been climbing for about the last 6 or 7 years. 2017, record year. 2018 and 19 dipped a little bit, but they are still well above the long-term norms. And then 2020 was just an incredible harvest. Certainly, we have growing deer herds in many places that are responsible for this. This is the first year of COVID where we had a lot more participation during deer season, which is responsible for that. So there's a few things that go into this, but this is an incredibly high buck harvest number. And I'll share some historically significant data around this here in a couple slides. All right. Well, we always take it then and look at as well, like what states are shooting the most bucks. You know what? Texas almost always leads this list, but they're the biggest state, right? They have a lot of deer hunters. They're a huge state. So it's not real fair to just throw this list up there. So what we do then is take this and say, okay, here's who shot the most bucks, but let's see who shot the most bucks on a per square mile basis. This makes much more of an apples to apples comparison across the country. And as you can see here, Maryland makes the top 5 lists. And I will say with this, shooting about 3 antler bucks per square mile, to give you some perspective, this is a really, really high deer harvest rate. I've been with QDMA and now NDA for 20 years. Prior to that, I was the state of New Hampshire's deer and bear project leader, and there were places in New Hampshire that literally had less than 5 deer per square mile. It was a standing crop, all the bucks and all the does and all the fawns. So to think that in Maryland, you guys can average shooting about 3 antler deer per square mile, just to let you know, this is an incredibly high deer harvest rate. So lots and lots of bucks hitting the ground in Maryland. Well, we also take a look at this as, okay, what is the buck harvest on a per 100 deer hunter basis? Some states, we can look at it per square mile, which is very helpful, but let's also look at it on the actual number of hunters that we have here. In Mississippi, they lead the country. This is crazy to think, for every 100 deer hunters they have in their state, they kill 74 bucks. This is amazing. But you know what? In Maryland, you guys just missed the top 5 list, and you are way above average as far as the country goes relative to the number of hunters, that will kill a deer. So yeah, for every 100 deer hunters, just over half of them in Maryland kill a buck each year, which is pretty astounding. All right, well, let's shift gears in and talk about antlerless harvest, because this is really where the rubber meets the road relative to deer management programs. This is where we can either balance our deer herd with what the habitat can support and have very healthy conditions, or dramatically under harvest, have way too many deer and lots of deer human conflicts. Well, the number of antlerless deer that we shot in those same 3 regions was about 3.2 million antlerless deer, which was a huge jump from the prior year. Now, remember with the buck side, how we had been having these climbing buck harvests, and I said in 2017 we had a record harvest. It's a very different picture from the antlerless side. We have had a huge drop in the number of antlerless deer that we've shot over the past 5 to 10 years prior to the 2020 season. Part of this was by design back in the 2014, 2015 season. A lot of state wildlife agencies that had balanced deer herds with a habitat, so they were prescribing less antlerless deer be harvested. We also had a terrible hemorrhagic disease outbreak in here. We had lost millions of acres of CRP land, which was phenomenal habitat for deer in much of the Midwest. The stuff was put back into production, crop production. So a lot of things were going on in the early teens here. Well, as hunters, if we start seeing fewer deer and think there's something wrong, we're real quick to reduce our antlerless harvest. So we've had a lot of state wildlife agencies the last few years, really begging hunters again, hey, we need to turn up the throttle on what we're shooting antlerless wise. And as hunters, we can be a little slow to respond. And so it was really nice to see this increased harvest in 2020 to get us back on track with what a lot of state wildlife agencies are asking hunters to do, to make sure that we can keep very healthy deer herds, in a situation where we're not degrading habitat and negatively impacting other wildlife species. Well, we also look at the age structure from the antlerless side, and remember what I showed you for the bucks. This one is a little different because this also includes fawns, and this one has been very consistent for the last several years. Nearly 20% of all the antlerless harvest each year is contributed of fawns, and that's a very healthy situation. Particularly in places like Maryland, where you have, and especially the eastern half of your state, where you have really productive habitats and opportunity to have very productive deer herds, a lot of fawns on the ground, a lot of fawns still alive come opening day of deer season. So what we typically see is nearly 20% of these harvests are fawns. And then as you look at the age structures after this, actually on the doe side, we have the average age of does out there is older than bucks. And remember, I said we have a better age structure for bucks today than we've had in about 100 years. But on the doe side of it, the doe side is even more advanced from an age structure side than bucks. And that's simply because we just don't harvest them at the same rate in many cases, which just allows more does to get into that 2, 3, 4, 5, 6+ year old age class. Well, all right, let's look and see who's shooting most of the antlerless deer. You know what? For the past couple of years, Texas has actually topped this list as well. That's not always the case. There's many years in Texas that they don't shoot anywhere near this number of antlerless deer. But you can see your neighbor to the north, Pennsylvania, is on this list. That's the only other state that we have here in the Northeast. But hey, let's look at this the same way we did the bucks. Let's look at it on a per square mile basis. And what we see is you guys are number 2 in the country. And in fact, if you remember, you're shooting 3 bucks per square mile. You're shooting over 5 antlerless deer per square mile. These are astounding harvest rates. You know, you have to have an incredible standing crop of deer to sustain this. And you guys do. You have a lot of deer, obviously a number of deer hunters that are going to field, but to be able to maintain this level means, you know, you are pumping a lot of deer into the system and obviously have a large number of deer to support this. And this is not a one-year thing. You guys always are at or near the top of this list. But one thing that's very unique about this is take a look at the top 4 states here. You know, and you don't have to be a geography wizard by any means to realize, hey, you know, these are all in the mid-Atlantic part of the country. And you know what? The mid-Atlantic is a real sweet spot when it comes to deer populations. We have great habitat. We have great variety of vegetative cover types. We have winters that are pretty mild from a deer perspective in most cases. We have summers that aren't nearly as hard as they are in the Southeast. So it's just a really good region for growing deer. In Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, and Maryland absolutely grow a lot of deer, which is very cool. If you're a deer hunter or a deer enthusiast, you know, I've been a wildlife biologist for over 25 years now, but I will say this, I am first and foremost a deer hunter. So I think this is really cool to live in this region and be from this part of the country relative to what it can produce for whitetail numbers. Now, the flip side of that, though, is there's a big responsibility on deer hunters here. You can't live in a region that has this type of production and harvest a very small number of deer on an annual basis or maybe an every other year basis. It's fun to have these deer, and like anybody else, I like to see a lot of deer when I go hunting. However, there's a responsibility here to make sure that we are doing our part to take enough antlerless deer to keep these deer herds in balance with what our habitats can support. That's being a good steward of the resources. And we want every deer hunter out there to make sure that he or she are good stewards of our wildlife resources. This is one of the reasons that these state wildlife agencies continually promote, you know, the education to hunters on the needs for harvesting antlerless deer, providing ample opportunities, and in most cases anyway, for hunters to be able to do that, to make sure that these deer populations aren't growing above what those habitats can support from a healthy standpoint. Well, all right, let's look at this and also on the antlerless harvest per 100 deer hunters, just like we did for the bucks. And lo and behold, you guys top this list. To think that for every 100 deer hunters, 86 of them are shooting antlerless deer. One, it's astounding that it is this high, but two, it also shows, hey, there's a lot of knowledgeable hunters in Maryland recognizing the need to fill those antlerless tags that the DNR is making available. There's some states that, you know, that would certainly should be much higher on this list, given the numbers of deer they have, but hunters either just aren't as willing or they're not as knowledgeable about why. So I think it's pretty cool that Maryland tops this list. You guys are always near the top of this, and that is a really, really good thing. Because I'm going to share this with you. Nationally, only 41% of all the deer hunters in the U.S. this year will shoot a deer. So stop and think about that for a minute. Only 41% will shoot a deer. Way less than half. And only 18% are going to shoot more than one. So even though most states have, you know, you can a multiple bag limit, a lot of states have a multiple buck bag limit and a multiple antlerless deer bag limit, but less than half of the hunters are going to shoot one deer. That doesn't work when you get into the mid-Atlantic region, you know, when you have these highly productive deer herds. But in Maryland, you are well above the national average. In Maryland, on average, about 56% of your hunters shoot a deer. Very, very good. Remember, the national average is 41%. You guys are at 56, so that's great. And nationally, only 18% of hunters will shoot more than one deer. Well, in Maryland, it's about 27%. So over a quarter of your hunters take at least 2 deer. That is great. So kudos to the DNR for providing, you know, the information, the knowledge of why to do this. And even more importantly, kudos to Maryland's hunters for taking advantage of those opportunities and continuing to harvest additional deer. If you look in the US today, about 1 out of 7 households are food insecure. Think about that. 1 out of 7 households don't have enough protein. So here is, I think, a perfect opportunity for deer hunters to be the champions of this. We can harvest additional antlerless deer that need to be harvested, helps our overall deer management program, helps our forest wildlife, helps our cover that's out there, helps other wildlife species. This is great. And at the same time, we can donate this and put food on the tables of families that need protein. It is a win-win situation, and it's hunters being the champions of this and answering a call. So I think this is a tremendous opportunity that many hunters have, and one that we all should take advantage of. All right. Well, if we take a look at the seasons in totality, then hunters together shot just over 6.3 million whitetails in the 2021 season. This is the most that we've shot in a decade, which is really cool. And remember when I talked about the buck side of it, the buck harvest is the highest in the past 21 years. So hunters really got after the bucks. Part of this was because we had more people hunting. Part of this was because we have increasing deer populations. All those years in a row where we have reduced antlerless harvest and these increased buck harvest, well, that's one of the measures of being able to estimate, standing crop of deer is, watching that buck harvest. And the fact that, that continues to climb year after year to some of these historic levels is a very good sign that deer herds, are increasing. So we have very high deer herds out there in many places, and hunters absolutely took advantage of that in that 2021 season. So very good. A lot of venison went into the freezers, which is great. That's exactly where we need it to be. All right, let's shift gears then. Let's talk about some of the national issues or trends impacting deer management programs and deer herd health across the landscape. Well, we can't talk about the deer programs without giving a disease update. And remember, all of this data is in that 2022 deer report. So you can go back and grab this and see where it's, we provide a lot more information in there than what I'll show today. But last year, hemorrhagic disease was confirmed in 23 states. And overall, though, it was listed as a light to moderate year by the Southeastern Disease Wildlife Cooperative Study, which is the disease or the vet school out of the University of Georgia that does much of this testing and surveillance for states across the United States. Of course, if you were impacted by it right where you were, you might not think that it was a light or moderate year. And but over the whitetails range, it wasn't too bad, which was good. At that point, CWD was in 29 states. It's in 30 states now. It's also in 5 provinces, Korea, Norway, and Finland. From this provincial end, some folks will say it's been in 5, some say 4. We use 5 because one of the ones that's often left out is Ontario. CWD has been identified in the Toronto Zoo, which obviously is in Ontario. So that's why I say 5 here. We include Ontario as one of the provinces that has confirmed this disease. Fortunately, they have not confirmed it in the wild or found it in the wild, and let's hope it stays like that for a long time. But they did find it in captivity. But I share this also to let folks know, those are the 2 things that are most in the news from a disease end, but there's a lot of other things out there that impact deer herds, things like bovine tuberculosis. Fortunately, Michigan is nearly the single state that's impacted by this. Indiana had an outbreak a couple of years ago, but that is one thing that is a very real and very serious disease of deer, particularly from a human standpoint. But there's other things like lungworm, certainly tick-related things. Triple E is Eastern equine encephalitis that we see a little bit. SARS-CoV-2 is a big thing this past year and continues to be in the news relative to deer showing antibodies, for COVID-19. So there's lots of other things as well that do impact deer, although CWD and EHD or hemorrhagic disease are by far the 2 biggest. Well, we take a look at all of the deer that get shot, and we break this out by each state, but I'm going to combine this together here and just show you nationally of all the deer that are harvested in the 2021 season. About 9% of them were shot with a muzzleloader. And if you'll remember early on, I'd said about 15% of all of our hunters use a muzzleloader. So they take about 9% of the total harvest. Just over a quarter of it's taken with archery equipment. And this number has been very stable for about the last 5 years. 20 years ago, that number was a lot closer to 15%. It climbed partly through expanded crossbow use expanded archery opportunities with longer seasons. But really for the last 5 or 6 years, that has stabilized right at about a quarter in any given year. And then still about 2/3 of our harvest year in and year out are taken with either a rifle or shotgun. So by being able to monitor this over time gives us a good clue on, hey, are there big changes going on? Are we adding a bunch of hunters into different user groups here? And what we find in many cases is even with these expanded archery opportunities, we're not adding a lot of new hunters. They were hunting already in our firearm seasons, killing deer then, but hey, they take advantage of this earlier season from an archery standpoint in many cases to shoot a deer, put a deer in the freezer earlier in the year, take advantage of a little nicer weather in many cases. So state wildlife agencies on average provide more opportunity today, just the sheer number of days that we can go deer hunting than we had a decade or two ago. And hunters are taking advantage of it. And that's a very good thing. We added this year, on average fawn weights. Hunters are always interested in, hey, size of the fawn in their jurisdiction. Is it near others? How does it compare to different states? But the average dress weights for fawns across the whitetails range is about 56 pounds. This ranged from 40 pounds in Alabama to 83 pounds in Illinois. And to give you some idea of what this would mean live weight, it would be somewhere between 51 and just over 100 pounds live weight. So think of that. I've lived and worked in Florida. I've hunted in some states that, the deer that were 1 or 2 years old, in some cases only weighed about 100 pounds live weight. But yeah, so that's what the average fawn weighs in Illinois and in some of the more heavy ag production states. And certainly in the Eastern Shore of Maryland, you have some deer that probably approach this. In Maryland, average fawn dressed weight was about 61 pounds, which puts it just under 80 pounds live weight, which is a good size fawn for sure. We also asked this about yearling buck weights. Those bucks that are 1.5 years old, what we found the average dressed weight was about 100 pounds. And this ranged from 70 in Texas to a whopping 140 pounds in North Dakota. Estimated live weight here was somewhere between 90 and 180 pounds. And man, it certainly has my feelers going up with regard to North Dakota. I've hunted that state numerous times. I know they certainly have big deer there. I was very surprised that that's what their dress weight was. We checked with them. They confirmed that 140 was not a live weight, but a dressed weight. But either way, that's an astounding weight here to be at the upper end of this. In Maryland, your yearling bucks averaged about 104 pounds dressed, which puts them at about 133 pounds live. So good size animal for sure. And one of the neat things about this is, you can monitor this over time just to see, hey, what's the trend in this way? Are we seeing fawn and yearling buck weights that are trending up? Are they trending down? Of course, if they're trending up, that suggests increased nutrition and increased health of those animals, which is one of the components that your deer program, will take a look at, as one of the pieces to monitor how healthy is that deer herd. We also asked relative to, hey, when is your firearm season regarding yearling buck dispersal? This is a big thing as CWD continues to spread, because one of the ways that the disease can move across the landscape is by, moving with yearling bucks that are dispersing. Lots of research shows that between 1/2 and 3/4 of all the yearling bucks out there will disperse, from their natal range. They're going to go 1 to 5 miles. It occurs somewhere between them being 12 and 18 months old. So a lot of this happens about time that we're hunting them. So one of the management strategies is, hey, can we kill a bunch of these yearling bucks prior to them dispersing and prior to them potentially moving this disease to a new area? So we asked all the states, hey, when is your primary firearm season, which is when most of the buck harvest occurs in these states. And what we found is about 1/3 of the states have their primary firearm season either before or during that yearling buck dispersal, while nearly 2/3 it occurs afterwards. And so what this means is, and in Maryland here, yours occurs after the primary dispersal period. Pennsylvania has been very vocal from the Game Commission and saying, hey, we know that by the time our firearm season comes around, our yearling bucks have already dispersed anyway, and the yearling does as well. A much smaller percentage of does are going to disperse, but some do. So, that's not a real management strategy for us to be able to try to eliminate that disease or limit the spread of it at that time, from a firearm season, because they simply have already dispersed. So we asked this question to states just to see, hey, when is the timing for us? Is this a viable management strategy, something agencies should be looking at or not? And certainly hunters are interested in this. So I think it's pretty interesting, that the vast majority of the Northeast and the closest part of the Midwest to us, our seasons all occur well after those deer have dispersed. So this may not be as viable of a CWD management strategy as some other states that have an opportunity to shoot the majority of their bucks, before they leave their natal range. Well, antler restrictions are always a popular subject with hunters. And so we surveyed states. We haven't done this for a few years. We just wanted to see, hey, where are antler restrictions being used or, being implemented at the state level? And what we saw is that there's at least 21 states that currently have them. Those are the states in red. The 7 states that you see here with a star are states that have those antler restrictions statewide. You guys are one of those states. So the rest of the states either use them in certain counties or certain wildlife management units or certain districts. We also then break this down to the different restrictions that are used. Antler point restrictions are by far the most popularly used. That's what we see here in red. Antler spread restrictions are used by a couple of states. The ones in blue here these are combination where they say, okay, the deer has to meet one of 2 or 3 requirements. Either has to have a certain number of points or a certain main beam length, or maybe it has to have a certain inside spread or a certain main beam length. So those are a little more biologically sound because they can do a better job really separating yearling bucks from those deer that are 2.5 or older. The 2 states that you see that looked a little different here, Arkansas and Tennessee. In Arkansas, part of their state uses antler point restrictions, part of their state uses antler spread restrictions. So it's not a true combination. It's not one or the other. It's just they do it differently based on where you are. Same thing for Tennessee. Some of their wildlife management areas use a point restriction. Some of the wildlife management areas have a combination restriction that they use. And I will say this, 10 years ago, antler restrictions were probably the number one topic that I was asked about, the hottest thing out there. And that's not the case anymore. I think in large part just because we have such a more balanced age structure for bucks today than ever before, and hunters, are just fundamentally passing many of these yearling bucks, even if they have the opportunity to shoot them. So there's a couple states that hunters really get riled up with antler restrictions, but in most cases, I hear very little from hunters about this today, certainly relative to what I did in the past. Well, one of the things that's interesting here is we also asked, hey, which states have deer management assistance programs? These are places where it's a site-specific management can occur on these private lands or public lands, but it's where the state wildlife agency works with either that landowner to, in many cases, provide additional antlerless licenses to allow for additional removal of antlerless deer only. And there's a lot of different varieties of how these programs are implemented. Some are very simple. Hey, you sign up, and you get additional tags. Some get visits from the state wildlife agency, from the biologist. Some include management plans, some don't. So there's a lot of variation here, but in a sense, it allows for better management of site-specific deer populations, so which is really good. We've looked at this for a number of years. This past year, 22 different states, those that you see in blue, have DMAT programs. This is an increase from 14 states from a few years ago. These started in the Southeast and have grown a bunch since. So you guys are kind of between, it's growing up from the South, it's kind of growing down from the North. But this is something you don't have in Maryland, but there is certainly some application for this, and it's possible that just the sheer number of antlerless deer that you typically harvest, that you just don't need this. But states that don't harvest as many or as many as the state wildlife agency wants really benefit from DMAT programs. And both personally and professionally, I am a huge fan of deer management assistance programs. We also ask about earn a buck. This is pretty interesting because there is nothing that an agency can do to increase antlerless harvest more than implementing an earn a buck program. And what this is it requires hunters to harvest an antlerless deer first to then have the ability to harvest a buck. Of course, all deer hunters want to shoot bucks, and I get it. I'm right there with them. But these are places that they're used, and none of these states used them statewide, but they used them in places where they had tried everything else to increase the number of antlerless deer harvests and just couldn't. So then they use these. 8 states currently use them. About a decade ago, there were more states. Wisconsin was famous for these in the past. Typically, though, deer hunters don't like these because it forces them to do something that some hunters simply don't want to do. And then some miss out on the opportunity to shoot a buck, if they don't shoot an antlerless deer first. So these typically are not very popular with hunters, but man, they are an extremely effective way to increase antlerless harvest in places that need it. None of the states that use these statewide. They just use them in very select areas where we, just really overabundant deer herds, that after the agency has tried everything else to get hunters to shoot more antlerless deer, they then have to use these. But suffice to say, when these are put into play, they are extremely effective. We also asked about research funding, and this is pretty cool because a lot of hunters don't realize the amount of dollars that are pumped into research programs each year. And of course, this is very fitting for our University of Maryland extension presentation here. But what we found is the vast majority of states are funding deer research projects. The amounts that they gave range from $30,000 to $5 million in California, which is incredible. These were the top 5 themes or project ideas that folks were doing. A lot of deer movement studies, a lot of survival of mortality studies, certainly a bunch of disease stuff. So pretty neat to see what the theme was across to the range. You guys are doing some in Maryland as well. $100,000 worth, which is really good. It didn't fit into any of these categories that you see here, but it's more from looking at from the social end of it and hunter preferences, which I think is really good. State wildlife agencies engage hunters today at a higher level than they ever have before. More hunters want to be engaged with what's going on, have a say in what's going on, which is great because the more engagement there is, then there's more opportunity to share information. There's more opportunity for knowledge of how to be a good steward and how to be a good participant, and hunter preference research like this plays largely into that. We know that, as older hunters phase out, newer hunters have different views of what should happen, maybe how they want to hunt. So it's good that to be able to have this hunter preference data to be able to stay very current relative to what the customers want, and what the stewards in the land would like to see to make sure they stay engaged with hunting and continue to be good participants there. So I'll end with a few mule deer things here. And I know there's no mule deer in Maryland. Maybe some of you want to go out west somewhere hunting mule deer. So I'll share some data. We take a look at the antlered mule deer harvest here as well. And then I will say this, Montana tops this list. It's a wide known fact that Colorado has more mule deer than anybody else, and their hunters kill more mule deer than anybody else. But we tried repeatedly to get that data from Colorado and just couldn't. There were only a couple of states in the U.S. that we couldn't get the survey data from. Colorado was one of them. But so anyway, this gives you an idea. But compare this, remember, to the top 5 whitetail harvest. When we were looking at 200, 300, 400,000 whitetails, this is just a fraction of what we're talking about there. Mule deer exist at a much, much lower density than whitetails do. We can take a look at this then also from a harvest per square mile. And look at this. Montana at 0.28. Do you remember how many antler bucks per square mile you kill in Maryland? Remember, it was 3, not 0.3, it was 3. So harvest rates for mule deer are far, far less than whitetails. And lastly, we can look at it on a per 100 deer hunter basis. If you're looking at someplace going out west to be able to hunt, Nevada or Wyoming certainly top this list with success rates relative to the number of deer hunters. Part of this is simply on the number of tags that are available. It can be more difficult to get a tag, but this shows you some of the success rates for states. And of course, you can look in the report to see all of the states that manage mule deer, how this fits out. But Nevada tops the list here. So last thing I'm going to show you then is just kind of break out what states lead the country relative to the different harvest methods. So the top bow harvest states, this means of all the deer that are harvested in any given state, who shoots the highest percentage or the highest numbers of those with archery equipment. Do you think Maryland makes this list? A lot of bow hunters in Maryland. Well, New Jersey tops this list, and New Jersey always leads this list. Very few states shoot more than half of the deer, with archery equipment. New Jersey, think about this. It's the most urbanized state in the country. There's a lot of firearm ordinances. They simply don't have the opportunity to shoot firearms in many places where there are a lot of deer. So New Jersey almost always tops this list, and this is percentage there is growing into percentage of deer in the Garden State taken with a bow. In Maryland, you guys are about a third. Year in and year out, usually just over a third of your total harvest are taken with archery equipment. Well, if we take a look at top muzzleloader states, there's a bunch of folks here in the New England region of the country on here. And more than anything else, it's because as you get up there, lower productivity deer herds, you don't have anywhere near the same antlerless harvest opportunities that you have in most other places. Virginia being the exception here. So with this, in most parts here, the states on this list is because this is the best opportunity to shoot an antlerless deer is with a muzzleloader. In many cases, you simply can't with a firearm, or it's really, really restricted. So you're either shooting, if you want to take a doe, with a bow or a muzzleloader, and obviously effective range of muzzleloader is way farther than a bow. So that's why you're seeing most of these states here. In Maryland, it's about 16% of your deer taken each year are with a muzzleloader. The last one then is the rifle or shotgun states. And if you take a look here, most of these will be out west. South Carolina slides in here, but once you get to the extreme west, not a lot of bow hunting or muzzleloader hunting going on. Big wide open areas, long shooting in many of these. So the western states always dominate this part of it. And in Maryland, you guys are right at about half. So year in and year out, about half your deer harvest are taken with the firearm. So with that, all that data was here. All of our whitetail reports are on our website at deerassociation.com. They are all free downloads. So if you're a deer nut or a deer enthusiast, I strongly encourage you to go and grab them. You can see how Maryland or whatever state you're from compares to your neighbors or others in the region with this. And the biggest issues impacting your deer herd on any given year. We're going to go through a Q&A here now. I love to have an interactive session with the audience. I'm looking forward to that. At the end of this, though, if there was a question you wanted to ask that you didn't get to, you can reach me at kip@deerassociation.com. I am glad to answer anything I can to help, whether it's on something deer related, something habitat related, or whatever, and whether it's something today I talked about or sometime in the future. So please feel free to reach out to me at any point. I'm glad to help. And with that, Luke, we have some time left, I guess, 11 minutes for questions. So I'm glad to answer anything I can.
Yeah, well, thank you, Kip. That was a really interesting presentation. It was great to see the sort of differences across states and how all the different aspects of the statistics on deer hunting. Well, we are fortunate that we also have Brian Eiler on our webinar, and he is our deer project leader for Maryland, and he was able to chime in with some of these statistics, but I'll read them out loud for the audience who didn't see it. Some people were wondering how many deer are killed by vehicles compared to the number killed by hunters. And Brian Eiler had those statistics handy, and he wrote to the whole group saying about 30,000 deer are struck by cars compared to 70 to 80,000 taken by hunters. So that's an interesting number to see. So a lot more by hunters, but still a lot by deer. And he also answered a question about what was included in deer harvest, whether it included wounded losses, road kills, crop damage kills. So, and he articulated that the harvest figures are only from those checked in by hunters, so confirmed kills that were recovered or checked in by hunters. And crop damage kills are maintained in a separate database for population modeling. So there's some other questions we had come in, and if anybody here, I think we have a few more coming in, but there was one up there that somebody was asking about whether new headlights on cars might be causing increased deer vehicle collisions. I'm curious if you've seen anything about that, Kip. Apparently there was a recall from some Chevrolet headlights. Do you have any insights on that one?
I don't have any insights specifically on the headlights like that. There's one thing though that goes along with that. Some research here, I guess probably 2 years ago now, showed that actually one thing from a lighting perspective that did reduce deer vehicle collisions was those light bars that are much more popular today that people put on their vehicles. But rather than putting them on and have them shine away from the vehicle, reversing it, putting it on the front and having it shine back toward the vehicle, where it illuminated much more of the vehicle than just the headlights, had a statistically significant drop in actual deer vehicle collisions. So, there's been a lot of research on how to reduce those with reflectors and sounds and all this. And that far and away was the best way to reduce your chances of hitting a deer. I'll admit, I don't have a light bar on my truck facing back, although every time I look at one in Tractor Supply, I think that I should do that. And I haven't seen them on vehicles facing back, but it's pretty interesting. It basically just means that as a deer can see more of what's coming, they are far more likely then to avoid getting near that. So I think that's some pretty neat research showing that.
Interesting. Yeah. I feel like there has been some selection pressure for deer in headlights. I do find that when I see deer now and they're in my headlights, they run. So I don't know if there's been a change in behavior over the last 30, 40, 50 years of deer vehicle collisions. But I was just thinking that the other day, how much they run when they do see headlights, for me at least. We had another question. What is the explanation for the 2, 3, 4-fold increases in the deer harvest since the 70s?
Part of it was simply just growing deer herds. And, at that point, hunters were still harvesting far more antlered bucks than antlerless deer each year. And in fact, it wasn't until 1999 that as a nation, we shot more antlerless deer than antlered bucks. So what we have is, we have all of these deer herds that were growing because we were shooting not that many antlerless deer. So deer herds continued to grow and grow and grow and grow. So that's why there are so many deer in the landscape. But then finally, by the late 90s, and this was about the time that the QDMA was established and really developing education programs to convince hunters to start shooting antlerless deer. So that's why we had a lot of recovering deer herds very high. This pendulum kind of swung the other way over the past couple of decades. Hunters were really backing off, but we have growing deer herds again. We're into that probably that 30 to 32 million whitetails in the US, which is up from about 28 to 30 million just a few years ago. So, and there's a lot of states, really reaching out to hunters to start getting a handle on those deer herds again. We have fewer hunters in many cases, some growing herds. So, lots of opportunities. If somebody today wants to go deer hunting or they're a new hunter, man, they are getting in at a really, really good time.
Great. Woodrow Shields asked, and maybe Woodrow, if you're free and want to unmute yourself, you can maybe clarify this. But Woodrow asked, which states use a calculated deer harvest? And maybe that refers to estimated through calculations versus actual harvest. Not sure if maybe that resonates.
Yes, for you. This is Woodrow. They call me Woody. I know Pennsylvania uses calculated deer harvest, which is quite controversial. What percentage of other states uses a calculated deer harvest?
That's a great question, Woody. Every state that provides us the data that they use or they calculate what their deer harvest is, of course, they're all estimated. And there's a few different techniques that the states will use for that. Pennsylvania has the report card system, and then they can check that based on they get the state wildlife agency gets their hands on 20 to 30,000 deer a year at meat lockers, taxidermists, et cetera, that they can then check to see, hey, what percentage of hunters actually reported their deer like they're supposed to? So they're able to then provide a correction factor and estimate what the actual deer harvest was. There are several states that do a system very, very similar to Pennsylvania. There are some states that simply sample a small percentage of their hunters after the season with a survey. So there's a handful of different ways, a pretty small number though, that state wildlife agencies use across the country. At the end of the day, are any one of them 100% accurate? Probably not, but they have all been shown to be extremely accurate at estimating numbers of deer and then monitoring that number over time. So if Pennsylvania says we shot 300,000 deer this year, it probably didn't shoot at that, but it probably was very close to that. Might have been a little lower, might have been a little higher, but it was very close. The real important part of that, Woody, then is, okay, let's use that same technique and estimate it again next year and the year after, so that you start developing this trend data so that we can see what that is. But what goes with that, and what a lot of states do, is in addition to calculating the number that are harvested, they also collect data on herd health. So, they can see, okay, are our deer healthier today than in the past? Are they less healthy because they're just not getting enough to eat? So when they can combine those harvest estimates with deer herd health estimates and a habitat health estimate, that's when the system works the best.
Great. Woody had a follow-up question on, does the deer harvest correlate with the deer population?
Absolutely. Yep. And in most places, as those deer populations climb, deer harvest will climb with it. It's not always a one-to-one correlation, but they absolutely correlate with each other. And it goes even faster the other way. When you start reducing deer herds, suddenly, if hunters aren't seeing as many, some then will just be less willing to harvest an antlerless deer. So yep, and all states have models that can show very accurately how those numbers correlate to each other. But in general, as there are more deer, success rates go up.
Great. Well, I think that's all the questions that are in the chat right now. If you have anything else, we got a couple more minutes. Feel free to add it in there. I will add that I feel it's really reassuring to see how well Maryland has done in getting its antlerless population harvest up. I know there's very liberal regulations in our state to keep the populations down, especially in areas with high densities, which, especially in the eastern half of the state, is quite high. So,
and hey, I'll say I see the correction that Brian provided relative to the number of deer hunters, and I certainly appreciate the help there. And I will say I just grabbed my deer report to look because I put in what Maryland had in preparing for this presentation, and I realized that I used the line above Maryland and Maine. So when I said 200,000 hunters, that's actually what Maine has, not Maryland. My mistake. So thank you for correcting that, Brian. And that 50 to 60,000 is what you had reported, you or one of your deer staff had reported to us that we included in that report. So it was, I guess, my older eyes. I grabbed the wrong line there. So my apologies, and thanks for the correction.
We have one more question pop in here. Carolyn Knight asked, are harvested deer tested for various diseases, and is it safe to eat them?
Great question. If you are not in a disease zone, in most cases, harvested deer are not tested simply because, there are so few other diseases that impact deer, and, the vast majority of deer out there, are extremely safe and healthy to eat, and we strongly encourage people to eat them. If you're inside a disease zone, a CWD zone, it varies by state. We strongly encourage folks, if you're in a disease zone, to get that deer tested. That does two things. One, it provides the data to the state wildlife agency so they can determine prevalence of the disease and rate of spread, which is good for them. But then it also lets you know that, yes, hey, this deer is safe to eat or not. And the only way to know if a deer has CWD is to have it tested. And if it does, we encourage you not to consume it. So that if you're in a disease zone, absolutely get it tested. That helps you, and that helps the state, which then ultimately benefits the deer resource.
Great. And Brian Eiler also added that Maryland tests 700 to 1,000 deer for chronic wasting disease, primarily from that disease management area in the state, and adds that deer are safe to eat. And Carolyn, yes, CWD stands for chronic wasting disease. That's a prion-based disease. It's a big deal for big game management in the US right now. Well, with that, we are coming up on the 1 o'clock hour. I know Kip has other obligations right at 1 o'clock. So I want to say thanks to everybody for coming. Thank you, Kip, for joining us. I'd give a round of applause, a virtual round of applause. I'm sure everybody on mute is clapping right now. And thank you again. It was good to see you, and look forward to being in touch in the future.
All right. Well, thank you, Luke. It was good to see you. And thank you for what you and your staff do for the wildlife resources in Maryland. So, and have a good day.
Great. Yeah. And you will, as you sign out, you will receive a survey. You'll be taken to a survey where you can answer some questions about the presentation. So thank you all very much, and have a great day.